Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. First of all, I would like to thank you both for being here. So many of you. It's not a surprise, we're used to it, the festival, but I would also like to thank you for the deep respect that you've shown during the showing of this film, with a very harrowing experiences shared. We all know that the situation in Venezuela is very complex, and it's actually quite paradoxical to think that we in Europe might be better informed of what is happening in Syria than in Venezuela. Venezuela is very far away from here, it's a different country, and we need to think out of our own mental boxes with the good people and the bad people on the side. In Geneva here, it's the capital of human rights. Human rights is about expressing yourself, but it's also about listening, and this is the spirit in which we are going to hold this debate. In a few minutes, I will interview Margarita Cadenas, who will be on stage with me, and 3 other guests will join us. 2 on stage with us, and another guest through Skype from Venezuela. It's quite specific to this festival to go in depth into this issue. Not all of us around here think the same thing. We don't share the same point of view, and it's in this spirit that I will ask you to show the same respect to the guest speakers that you did during the showing of the film. Of course, there are people here in this room that will disagree with what will be said by our guests. They have the floor, and you also will. That's the principle of debate and discussion. So I will ask you to, if you want to participate in the discussions, to please ask questions and not only make long comments. If you don't have headsets, you can find some at the entrance of the room, and you can follow the debate in French, English and Spanish. And I would like to thank the interpreters to help us overcome the language barriers. I would like to call on stage Margarita Cadenas.
Venez avec moi, je vous en prie.
Please join me.
Nous allons rester debout pendant un moment pour vous faire face et mieux communiquer avec vous, parce que c'est important que l'on vous voit et qu'on voit les réactions du public.
We can see you and see the reaction of the public. So you are scenarist and filmmaker, Franco-Venezuelan. I have a first question. Olga, the last of these women, what's happened to her since you made the movie? Has she found peace, or is she still in pain? I'd like you to speak in the microphone. Well, first of all, good evening and thank you. Thank you all for being here tonight. I'd like to also thank the festival for giving me the opportunity to show this film. It's precisely why I made it, to show it. Until now, these informations on Venezuela are not talked about, and recently the international community has only realized how severe the crisis that the country is going through is. So that's one situation, one experience that is very interesting. But there's also Kim, the nurse. What does she do now? Kim has left the country. She now lives in the US. This film will be launched in April in the US, and I will have Kim with me in the Q&As. And we will be lucky enough to have her with us. Olga doesn't know. doesn't know what is happening. The hearings she's supposed to have are not taking place. Nothing is changing. There's no progress showing. As we all know, the justice system is in a deadlock, and Olga is losing hope.
Des choses terribles qui se passent au Venezuela. À Noël,
on top of these harrowing events that happened in Venezuela last Christmas, the tomb of her son was profanated, and the remains of her son were tempered with. I talk to her about twice a month, quite regularly. Was it difficult to film this documentary? Did you feel that you were putting these people in danger, and did you feel that your crew faced pressure? Well, first of all, we worked in Venezuela like as if we were spies, because of course in Venezuela you can't film in hospitals. You can't film people queuing for products. So we had very, very tiny cameras, hidden microphones. We were very discreet, extremely discreet in filming. There was one time at a hospital where we got really scared because they came to us and asked for our equipment. And you can see there is one scene where there was someone from the militia that saw the camera, and at that point the military came in. And thanks to Kim, who has a very strong personality,
pratiquement disputé militaires en leur disant qu'ils
almost got into a fight with them, with the militia, saying that they were getting involved in her work. And these 5 women, are they still in danger of retaliation from the state? Well, first of all, there are 2 that don't live in Venezuela anymore. And there's another one who is currently leaving the country. No one has seen this film in Venezuela, so it has been shown in France, in the Czech Republic, and now here. But for the moment, there's no problem with that. And the one who is taking the most risk might be Olga, but Olga told me I'm ready. I'm ready for anything to get justice for my son. Let's talk about justice now. Justice in Venezuela. Let's not be prejudiced here. We are curious, and we'll listen to someone here on the stage, someone that we talk about in the film, the public prosecutor of Venezuela. It's a very controversial public figure. We'll hear from her.
Et vous avez bien sûr, comme tout un chacun ici, proposer des questions. Je vous remercie. Je peux applaudir Margarita Cadenas pour tout son travail.
Debate, so I'm sure your contributions will be very valuable. We can all thank Margarita Cadenas.
Et puis maintenant, effectivement, je vais appeler, pendant que techniquement, je sais que nos amis techniciens vont établir la liaison par Skype.
My guests, and I will ask the technicians to establish the connection on Skype with the guest that we have from Venezuela. You've all seen the program, you know how unusual it is to have a round table with stakeholders that are this involved in the current situation.
Personnages intéressants avec lesquels nous avons préparé cette discussion, en prévoyant qu'il n'y aurait pas de long discours. Ce n'est pas non plus le principe de ce festival, mais confrontation d'idées. Oui, je vous en prie, madame.
Thinking that we wouldn't make long speeches. The idea is to exchange point of views.
Oui.
So let me remind you that there is simultaneous interpretation. So you have your headset, sir. Good evening. Please take your seat. So I will sit right here in the middle.
Je dois dire encore Madame la procureure, enfin en français on dit
Madame
la procureure,
prosecutor.
enfin en espagnol c'est Madame procureure, Luisa Ortega Diaz.
Luisa Ortega Diaz, thank you for being here with us tonight. For those of you who might not be familiar with public persona, I will only say this. After 10 years of hard, determined work, Mrs. Ortega Diaz is the public prosecutor of Venezuela, and it's an understatement to say that she has a lot of enemies. She imprisoned a lot of people, including Leopoldo Lopez, and we will have his wife with us on Skype tonight.
Lilian Tintori va certainement demander à Madame le procureur.
Lilian Tintori is with us through Skype, and she might
deux messieurs, d'abord Santiago Cantón, qui est l'ancien directeur exécutif de ce qu'on appelle
having imprisoned her husband.
La Cour interaméricaine.
And we have a representative of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Quite a position. You were at first against the decision of prosecutor to put Leopoldo Lopez in jail, but then you're also one of the 3 judges that have been mandated by the International Criminal Court for a preliminary inquiry on Venezuela. And to my left, Rafael, who is the voice of civil society. He is the general coordinator of one of the biggest human rights and economic rights NGOs. It's called Provea. It's one of the most important NGOs working in Venezuela, and Mr. Uzcátegui will tell us how he conducts his work in Venezuela. I'm looking at the screen right now, and I think Lilian Tintori has joined us through Skype. So if you don't know her, well, let's say that she's a colleague. She used to work on Venezuelan TV, and she's also a human rights activist married to Leopoldo Lopez. Mrs. Tintori, first of all, I would like to know if you can hear us well. Can you hear us well from Geneva here? Can you hear the interpretation?
Et du coup, je vais moi-même prendre ces écouteurs. Voilà, on arrive. Est-ce que vous nous entendez?
Can you hear us?
Est-ce que vous nous entendez bien, Madame?
Can you hear us, Mrs. Tintori?
Apparemment, un petit problème. Non. Voilà, je rappelle une nouvelle fois. Lilian Tintori, est-ce que vous nous entendez ici?
I'll try again, Mrs. Tintori. Can you hear us here in Geneva? Can you hear the journalists talking to you, Xavier, Colin, who will have a discussion with you and with the other panelists here on stage tonight? Can you say something if you can hear us? No? It's a minor issue that we're going to fix. I'm sure it's going to be fixed, and I think our technicians will...
Ok, can you hear us? On va le dire en anglais. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous entendre, madame, ici à Genève? Bon, on refait un petit essai, on ne va pas se laisser décourager du tout. Alors, je pense que la technique va nous dire... Non? Voilà. Bon, on va attendre un petit moment. Madame la procureure,
maybe we'll wait a little bit. Madam Prosecutor,
ceux avec qui vous travaillez,
you don't only have friends. Those who you used to work with may consider you as a traitor because you now criticize the regime and you're working against it. And those who you're working with now might have doubts on the sincerity of your motivation. Could you explain to us who are not familiar with the situation in Venezuela, can you explain to us how you could change your position on the situation?
Allez-y. Est-ce que vous avez bien entendu la traduction de la question?
Have you heard a translation of the question?
Oui, allez-y.
Well, you have the floor with the microphone.
Voilà. Alors prenez l'autre micro. Allez-y.
Sí, muy buenas noches.
Good evening.
Parlez bien.
Good evening, Xavier. Good evening, everybody.
Para todos los que están en el auditorio.
For everybody here tonight,
Primero quiero felicitar
I'd like to begin
a Margarita Cadenas
by congratulating
por
Margarita
este
Cadenas
extraordinario,
for this
Margarita se me fue, allá está.
wonderful
por
film.
este extraordinario video. Lamentablemente ya este video
Unfortunately, this is a
o la
film
realidad superó
that doesn't
lo que se
now
narra y se evidencia
correspond
de este material.
to
Por lo que tienes
the
un compromiso,
current reality.
Margarita, de hacer
Margarita has said that she will update
fuerte lo que
the
se está
film
viviendo en Venezuela.
on the events that are now happening in
Antes de
Venezuela.
entrar en detalles
But before
al respecto,
getting into all of the
quiero
details,
hacerte
I just wanted
mención a
to
que yo no he cambiado.
say that I haven't changed. I'm still the same person.
Sigo siendo la misma persona que estaba en el Ministerio Público.
I'm the same person who was in the Attorney General's office, the same person I was before, and the same person I still am.
Antes de entrar a este evento,
Before
un periodista me estaba
coming here
haciendo una
tonight, a
entrevista
journalist was interviewing
y
me
me decía
and
cuáles
asked
son las acciones que habría
what
que ejecutar en Venezuela para la
would need to be done
restitución de los derechos
in Venezuela
humanos.
to
Algo
ensure
así.
that human rights are protected once again.
Palabras menos, me hacía esa pregunta.
That was more or less the question that I was
Hay
asked.
varios aspectos en Venezuela
There are various things in Venezuela
que
that
se deben enumerar para responder esa pregunta.
would need to be done
En este momento nosotros tenemos una
to
situación
ensure that human rights were protected
donde se
again.
ha
At the moment, we have a situation
invisibilizado el tema de los derechos
where
humanos.
human rights are no longer
Cuando
talked
yo
about.
estaba en el
They are
Ministerio
invisible.
Público, se
Now, when I was in the
iniciaban
Attorney General's office,
investigaciones y
we
se
did start investigations
visibilizaba
and we
el
did
tema de
talk
los
about
derechos humanos.
human rights.
La primera OLP, y yo voy a
The
explicar
first
para quienes no
OLP,
saben lo que es
the
la
Special
OLP.
Forces, and I'll explain
Son
what they are for
unos
those of you who don't know
operativos de
them. They are the
seguridad
Operativos de
ciudadana
Seguridad
que implementó el
Ciudadana. These are
gobierno en el
special forces that were
2015
set up by the
hasta
government in
el
2015,
2017.
and they were
En
operating
junio de
until
2015.
2017. In June 2015, they were created, these special
Estos
forces.
operativos se hacían con
And
los militares
they were special
y policías civiles.
military and
Es decir,
civil
que
police
no eran
squads.
operativos de seguridad ciudadana,
They weren't
sino eran
really
verdaderas razas
police. They were
para atacar a la población
death
más pobre.
squads to attack
Eran
the poorest
políticas
sections of the
dirigidas
population.
al exterminio
The idea
de
was to
personas
try to
que tenían quizás
assassinate
algunos problemas de conducta,
people
pero que
who
no
may
era
have been
la forma de
delinquents,
resolver
but
ese problema,
didn't deserve
porque
to be
la
killed in that
seguridad o
way,
inseguridad que
because
existe en
actually
un
the
Estado
insecurity
es responsabilidad del gobierno.
was the responsibility of the
Pues
government.
bien, la primera OLP que
So
se
the first
hizo en
OLP,
Venezuela,
Special Forces, who were
la
set up in
primera
Venezuela,
persona que tuvo o que salió públicamente
were
a denunciar la violación de los derechos humanos
criticized,
en las OLP,
and the first person
la fiscal
to
general.
stand up
Me refiero
and
de
criticize
las
the
que
violation of
ocupaban
human rights there
un cargo
was
de
the
poder, que
Public
ostentaban
Prosecutor's
un
Office.
cargo público.
That was the first
No
person
solamente
to
que
criticize
denuncié
that,
la
the public
primera, la
prosecutor.
segunda, la tercera y todas las
And
operaciones que se
they
hicieron.
continued to criticize all of
Y hay un material que está
the abuses
colgado
being perpetrated
en la
by these
página,
death
en mi
squads.
página web, que
There was something that I put up on my website that was
la totalidad de las víctimas, de
a
los
list of
fallecidos,
all of the victims.
505 personas ejecutadas.
505 people
Y
were
además todo el
murdered.
trabajo que hizo el Ministerio Público.
And then all of the work being done within
Estamos
the Attorney General's
trabajando para
office
publicar los
was to try
obstáculos que
to
tuvimos para que se hiciera justicia.
describe
Porque la
the
justicia
barriers to
es
obtaining justice.
un órgano
Because
donde
the
no
judicial
solamente
branch
está el Ministerio Público, están los
has
tribunales y
the
la policía.
public prosecutor's
La
offices,
policía
the
además
courts,
de
and the
ejecutar a los
police.
ciudadanos,
And of course, the
se
police were
negaban
actually
evidencias.
murdering
Se
people,
negaban y
and
continúan
they
haciendo
were
eso.
actually creating insecurity and continued to do that.
Je suis tout à fait votre... Alors, remettez les écouteurs. Je suis tout à fait votre raisonnement.
I follow your train of thoughts here, but I'm not asking you the question as a prosecutor or a judge. I'm asking you the question as a curious journalist. At what point did you realise that the measures that you used to take were not only not sufficient but also useless, and that repression carries on? Is it a political moment, or is it a personal moment, something that's deep inside you that made you realise that you had to quit?
I also think that I need to respond to the public, to the audience here as well, rather than just responding to you. Well, you can do it through me, of course. That's true. Because journalists can ask whatever questions they like. Journalists are always entitled, in fact, they have a duty to ask all of those questions. Of course. And it's always interesting to have a proper debate so that you can ask questions and we can try to respond to those questions with respect. I would like to say the following. In 2015, in January 2015, the Ministry of the Defense adopted Resolution 8610, making police activity a military activity, so that if there were any problems relating to insecurity, military were going to deal with it. And so a whole series of plans were drawn up, the Rondon Plan, for instance, saying that people had to be harassed. And these citizens' plans were drawn up as though it was a type of war situation, rather than people who were simply petty criminals. In 2015, I rose objections to that resolution. I did that internally. I sent a letter to the Ministry of Defense. I spoke with the President of the Republic, and I said that that resolution was a dangerous decision, and I had to come out in public and express my disapproval of that and say how I was opposed to it because it was in violation of human rights. The resolution also decreed that in protests, the police and the military were entitled to use firearms on demonstrators.
So what you're saying here is that your change in attitude stems from your experience at work. It's based on legal and judicial criteria, not just political criteria, like we might have thought.
Clearly, this is my conviction. This is what I believe and what I feel. These are my principles. And therefore, I knew that I had to work according to those principles to try to promote human rights.
Merci. Alors, je voudrais que la technique quelque part me fasse bien.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the technicians to get us back with Lilian Tintori, if we can. But before we talk about, I'll ask my question to Santiago Cantón, who used to be the Vice Director of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. You've carried out inquests, and now you're one of the 3 judges that have an ICC mandate for Venezuela. I have a very direct question for you.
Quand vous allez enquêter, est-ce que des personnages comme Madame Procureur seront dans votre ligne de mire?
In your inquiries on the field,
éventuellement poursuivis par la Cour pénale internationale?
people like Mrs. Ortega, can they be prosecuted by the ICC for their former activities?
Thank you. I'll reply to that question in a moment. But first of all, I'd just like to thank everybody. And I'd just like to raise an important question. And that is that on the 70th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights, we should think very carefully about the loss of importance of human rights, unfortunately, among governments all over the world. It's something that we need to think about, because if you look over the past 70 years, you'll see that the issue of human rights is no longer being talked about enough. It's not at the forefront of the agendas of all of the governments around the world. In fact, on the contrary, and that's the main challenge that we all have, to try and defend that idea. And Venezuela is, of course, part of that problem. The responsibility for what's been going on in Venezuela for the past 15 years lies with the government in particular. Of course, there is the inter-American community as well, which was unable to resolve that problem when quite clearly we started to see what was going on. And now I'll come back to your question. I think basically we're talking about the role of the International Criminal Court and what role it might have, and that really depends primarily on whether or not the International Criminal Court has a formal investigation opened, because for those of you who don't know, so far the International Criminal Court had a preliminary investigation opened, but there isn't a formal investigation opened yet. When the court opens, it will have to determine the responsibility of government officials, and that depends on how long the court has to investigate. It may have 2 years, or it may investigate the last 10 years, and that really depends on the International Criminal Court, which will determine individual responsibilities. The International Criminal Court tries to pursue individuals for individual responsibility. The Inter-American Court and the International Criminal Court are looking for state responsibilities. So many of the Inter-American human rights instruments are looking into responsibility of state. Since 2005, between 2005 and 2013, there were reports of clear human rights abuses in Venezuela. 3 reports were made by the Inter-American Human Rights Court demonstrating the series of human rights abuses that were taking place there. And in the last report, I'd recommend all of you to read it just a few months ago, it was quite clear that there were serious human rights abuses taking place.
Vous ne répondez pas directement.
You didn't answer my question fully. My curiosity isn't satisfied. It's not. It's an important question. At which point are we responsible for our past in front of an international criminal court?
No, of course. When I was rapporteur for freedom of expression for the Inter-American Human Rights Court, at that time there was the Inter-American Commission that was starting to look into human rights abuses in Venezuela. And I would say you should go back to at least 2005, when it was quite clear that government officials ignored or supported human rights abuses of all kinds.
Attendez, une minute, on va maintenant.
As we have Lilian Tintori on Skype now, we are going to talk to her. Hope to see her on screen. There she is. First question, can you hear us well from Geneva? And well, first of all, allow me to welcome you in this debate.
Thank you very much. I can hear you now.
Okay, so now that we've established a connection, as we said, you are a human rights activist. You've worked on TV. You're well known in Venezuela. You're not just the wife of Leopoldo Lopez, but you are Leopoldo Lopez's wife. For those of you who are not aware of the situation, your husband is under house arrest. He cannot leave his house. He has a very interesting political past, because if I understand things well, he almost got elected as president, and he had a campaign after which he was put in prison. So, Mrs. Tintori, for those of us here in Geneva, do you have a specific message you wish to convey?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the International Festival for this opportunity. Geneva is the capital of human rights, and I've learned a lot over the past few years, and they've always listened to me, and I've learned a lot from that in trying to wage the struggles that I struggle with trying to promote the rights of all Venezuelan people. And it's an honor for me to take part in this panel discussion. It's a very varied and interesting panel with Santiago, who is a professor and who's been a guide over the past few years. It's been a very difficult time for us. My husband is a prisoner. He's been a prisoner for 4 years now, unfairly, along with his family. And Leopoldo Lopez, there are also 338 other political prisoners in Venezuela. Many of them have been tortured, they've been mistreated, they've been shut up in solitary confinement, they're not even allowed visits from their family, and for many days they are locked up without trial, without any due process, but with the hope of having freedom on one day, because now Venezuela is being held prisoner. 550 people have been murdered by the OLP Special Forces. That is a horrible figure, but that is a proven figure, and others on the panel can confirm that, I'm sure, in the course of the discussion. And 211 people have been murdered in peaceful demonstrations. Those are very painful figures, because we are out in the streets demonstrating, and then these people have been shot and murdered since between 2014 and 2017. Many of these young people, most of them were young, were shot in the head. They had smoke bombs thrown at them. They were shot. The police loaded up their guns and actually killed people deliberately. These are innocent young people. And each one of them was looking for democracy. They are heroes of freedom, because they were just fighting for freedom and democracy. And what's important to say to those people, and what's important to say to the people here tonight, is that you need to be aware of what Venezuelans are suffering. And we are resisting a dictatorship, because we have seen systematic human rights violations, because we live in a dictatorship. And the people sitting there, who are in the film, many of them were mistreated, and their family have been bullied and harassed, and many of them have fled the country through fear. And many of them have had members of their family taken hostage as well. And so this is a terrible situation. It's important to speak up for these people, these victims. So I'm very grateful to Kim, to Luisa, to Olga, to those people in that film, because their testimonies were extremely interesting. They are so brave, because many people in Venezuela aren't brave enough to talk about what they've suffered, because they're afraid of being taken prisoner or being killed, because there are systematic human rights abuses. This is a dictatorship where they don't respect the law, where we are all at risk. If we speak out, we can be harassed, because my passport has been taken away from me. That's why I couldn't come to Geneva. But the regime will never shut us up entirely. They aren't going to prevent us from speaking out for freedom for Venezuela. Because Venezuela is in chaos, as this film rightly shows, and as these women rightly say. But Venezuela is also a chaos of love and passion and hope, of strength. And this dream that we all have is to find our country once again, and we will do that together, because we don't hate. We have a great hope to reconcile the country and to continue to move forward to try to save Venezuela from the worst crisis that we have ever seen in our country. And many of people who know Venezuela will confirm that. Economists, politicians, civil society, human rights defenders, they will say that this is the worst crisis that we've ever seen in Venezuela. And it's a crisis of respect, because there was a lack of respect for fundamental rights. So we need to stand up. The whole of the world, actually, the international community needs to do more, because they can't leave us by ourselves. We need you. That's the message I would like to send out.
Alors, je vous remercie pour
You're getting a round of applause here in the room to commend this message of hope that you've just conveyed to us. I would like to ask you another question. Of course, you're going to stay with us during the debate, but I have another question for you regarding your husband. the best case scenario, what are the possibilities for him not to be under house arrest anymore, for him to find a certain level of freedom again? Do we need to wait for the results of the election on the 20th of May? And when the storm, if I can put it this way, is over, is there a glimmer of hope for the future? What do you believe?
I always have hope, and every day I pray and hope that one day this will happen, because I'm a victim as well. I'm a victim of this dictatorship, and today, as you were saying, I'm also a witness, and I'm very proud to be a witness, because all of us here are witnesses, and we have to speak out and do our best to try to achieve change in Venezuela. Every day I get up in the morning and I know that I'm going to bring back freedom to my people, full freedom, because my husband is locked up at home for the past 4 years. He's been in that situation, and that's 4 years of his life that have been lost. They've taken away those years, and he hasn't been able to see his children grow up. During that time, they've taken away his freedom. He's isolated, alone. He just has to stay in this house. He doesn't even have books or pens that have been taken away from him. All of that because he was in a military prison. But now he's back home, and the house is surrounded by police officers. My children are surrounded by weapons. 9 armed officers broke into my home a couple of years ago. This is violating the most basic human rights of my family and my children. And these were very difficult moments. But I always think of all other Venezuelans at this time. I was breastfeeding a 1-month-old child, and then my children were running away and saying the police were coming into the house. And these are terrible scenes that we've all lived through, but people all over the country have seen this, because they are breaking into people's homes all over the country without any warrants, without any arrest warrants, just because a decree has been given from above. I've heard presidential decrees so many times. Everything is just an order, and people are just obeying orders. But this is an order from Maduro, from the dictator, and there is no rule of law. And this is the danger that we face in Venezuela. I know that I'm going to be, at the end of the day, Leopoldo is going to be free because he's innocent. And that's true of all political prisoners in Venezuela. And thanks to political prisoners, the world will know the truth. Because political prisoners are the first thing that needs to happen for democracy to be killed in Venezuela. And that's what we've been seeing now. And now the international community is becoming aware of that. And this began in 2014 when Leopoldo was arrested. And he's innocent because the NGOs know that, the human rights community knows that. But very important people know that as well, because they've spoken out and told the truth. And they are ignored, these people who tell the truth. And I know it's not easy. I know it's easy because people are being threatened, people are afraid to speak out. But the people are innocent. All of this is a farce. And the trial was a farce. This is just an order that's been handed down from above in this dictatorship. There are no proof, there are no witnesses, and I have to say this, I have to explain this, because people abroad might even know about the details of what we're living through. I can tell you all of the details. I can tell you all of the details.
Simplement,
I don't want to be misconstrued as interrupting you, but it's not my role here in Geneva to have any say on possible reconciliation between Venezuelans. But I have here on my panel Mrs. Ortega Diaz. Do you have something to tell her? Is there something that you would like to share with her? And Mrs. Ortega Diaz, do you have something to say to Mrs. Lilian Tintori on exchanging views?
Por Venezuela,
oui, allez-y.
Siempre hay algo que decir.
Well, in Venezuela, there'll always be something to say about Venezuela.
Allez-y, on vous écoute.
We're listening to you. Go ahead.
Sí.
Well, we don't. We are all victims in Venezuela, victims of the dictatorship. But we also need to be witnesses and speak out. And speak out to others, because we need to seek justice as well for what has happened to us, and we need to try to resolve the problems that we face. And in many transitions around the world, reconciliation is necessary. We need to see reconciliation, even within authoritarian governments or dictatorships. People who've worked within those governments are key aspects in transitions and in looking for reconciliation and truth and justice. So anyone who believes in freedom and democracy in Venezuela, we need them, and we need their support. We need all of these people to speak out, and to speak out the truth, and denounce the systematic human rights abuses that are taking place, and clearly speak out against the dictatorship.
Et vous, madame, est-ce que vous êtes...
What about you, madam? Do you agree with what has been said? It's very consensual, and there's a lot of hope in Lilian Tintori's words. Do you have reservations, or do you encourage her to go in that direction?
Well, I'd just like to pay tribute to Ms. Tintori. I know that she has fought for her husband, fought for his rights, and I know that she's fought for the rights of many Venezuelans. And I think that deserves my respect, and I'd be delighted to discuss these things with you. And unfortunately, I know that you were harassed by military officers, and we actually at that time issued a protection order, and we tried to protect Lilian Tintori. And the military officer who was responsible for harassing her asked for that to be overturned and said that he deserved protection from Ms. Tintori. I mean, how ridiculous can you get? But I would say I agree that Venezuela needs everybody. Venezuela needs unity with a single objective. We need unity among Venezuelans, from civil society, teachers, university teachers, workers, housewives, anyone, irrespective of their political orientation, their ideology, their religion, or their beliefs. We need to see unity among Venezuelans, and we need to see pardons so that we can all work together for a single objective, and that would be to retrieve democracy and basic freedom in Venezuela, those dreams that we all had. We need to see progress and prosperity return in Venezuela so that Venezuela can be a country focused on development, where we all respect each other and where we can overcome hatred, that hatred which has spread and been spread by a small group of Venezuelans. In fact, not only hatred, but also this mutual suspicion that we are seeing now in Venezuela. And I think if we can walk together, irrespective of those differences, then I will be alongside you.
Rafael,
Rafael Uzcátegui, since we started this discussion, we're hearing terrible experiences, terrible stories. We hear about torture, repression, things that tend to be related to dictatorship. But tonight we're also hearing appeal to unity, some more consensual words. We hear about reconciliation in the name of national unity. You who lives in the country, what do you think will happen with the human rights in Venezuela? Isn't your fight, I'm not going to say useless, but does it still meet the needs of the people? Let me remind the audience that you are the director of a large NGO, Provea. What do you think is going to happen in terms of hope for the country in the future?
En primer lugar,
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking you for this invitation. Thank you for your welcome, and thank you to everybody for being so interested in Venezuela. The human rights community is very keen to raise awareness to the human rights abuses taking place in Venezuela. And as Santiago was saying, in very early days, these human rights abuses started to be seen. But if you only just listen to the government, then you might think that they were just invented, these human rights abuses. You might think that the government was telling the truth when they were applying discriminatory and violent policies. So it's been very important, I think, to raise awareness among the international community of what's going on in Venezuela, and doing the work that we continue to do on a daily basis. We don't work within institutions. We don't have an Attorney General's office who is actually working to protect people from the violence of the police and the authorities. We don't have an ombudsman who actually works for us. They actually deny the existence of a migration crisis. And unfortunately, the international community, which plays a very important role in terms of putting pressure on the government, are the only ones trying to help us. So we, within the country, are facing a situation where the institutions don't actually respond to the complaints that people are making, irrespective of their ideologies. Many people are victims of the use of power. The government has become involved in daily harassment. So I can understand these victims. I think it's important to document so that tomorrow, the experience of Latin America has shown us this, justice may come. Justice may come late, but it may come at some point. And we all hope very strongly that we can reach that day one day. Sometimes we need to convince ourselves of that, but we all have hope that one day democracy will come back and that human rights abuses will be punished.
Voilà.
Well, that is said. Thank you. Thank you also for talking about the international opinion, the opinion of the international community. Let's talk about Europe. The situation in Venezuela is very complex. As we've said, we all have very simple views on the situation in our minds, but we know now that there are different currents in the opposition in Venezuela. It's very difficult sometimes to understand what is actually going on in these circumstances. Can you actually count on the European public opinion? Don't you feel lonely sometimes?
We feel less and less alone, because it was unthinkable that a film like this might have been seen and by such a wide public just a few years ago, because our government was claiming to be progressive, and unfortunately that wasn't the case. So we feel less and less alone. We can see the support that we're getting now. We are seeing demonstrations over the past few years. We have impunity in our country, unfortunately, though. But now the international community is starting to become aware of what's going on in Venezuela. Unfortunately, some people have started to ask questions about the situation. For instance, for us, it was very important that some well-known Noam Chomsky at an international level started to ask what was going on in Venezuela. And there was also the Wesa Fione case. But then people started to ask questions about the situation rather than just supporting the government without being critical because it was a so-called anti-imperial government. But the public opinion has changed because of the evidence that's come out now.
Santiago Cantón, poursuivons sur cette ligne relativement optimiste.
Well, let's continue with these optimistic words. Let's now tackle the subject of the fight against impunity. Do you feel that justice will play its role at some point? And do you believe it will be related to a brutal change, a radical change, a democratic or political change? Do we have to wait a few years? So,
well, every country has its own dynamic. In Latin America, there have been numerous examples some very good examples, other not quite so good. But if you look at the process that's taken place after the dictatorships of the 1970s in Latin America, we can see that in some countries, including my own, only recently justice has been brought for those human rights abuses that took place in the past. So we had to wait almost 40 years for justice to be seen for those human rights abuses. There are many experiences of truth and reconciliation commissions, peace commissions, trials in Colombia, a series of trials in our beginning called transitional justice, and a great deal has been achieved. There are some examples in Argentina and in global level as well. There have been some examples where excellent results have been achieved. There have been forces in some countries who avoided justice being done. Now, Olga is looking for justice. And I think this complaint has come about 100. I've seen 100 or so cases like this at the Inter-American Human Rights Court. People just want justice when they see this human rights abuse. They want someone to be found responsible for the human rights abuse. That's what people are looking for when they're looking for justice. In a transitional situation, when there is a tradition with a government who leaves but has a considerable amount of power still, then justice is very difficult to achieve. So it really will depend on what happens in Venezuela in terms of the political process. There is a political change happening at the moment, but there may be a government change at some point, and then democracy will come back. And then there might be a justice a process for justice.
Rafael Uzcátegui.
When President Maduro will be re-elected on 20th of May, as we can very well imagine. Do we have to wait until 2025 until he is being replaced, or do you think that he can come up weakened from this election? The international community says that there's not much democratic value to this election.
When Nicolas Maduro was chosen by Hugo Chavez to continue his political approach, I had expectations for him because in 1993 he knocked on Provea's door. He was a trade unionist at that time in Caracas, and he was being harassed for his trade union activity. And we spoke with him, as we spoke to a number of victims at that time. And today, in the same chair where Nicolas Maduro was sitting, there are now the victims of human rights abuses. And we thought about changing that chair, actually, at one point, because it was getting a bit old. But it brings us some memories, that chair. And so we've kept it. But in Provea, what we're looking for is that we are defenders of the 1999 Constitution. And that Constitution established a mechanism which is within Article 233, which is the resignation of a president to go ahead with elections. And we are actually convinced, maybe we're wrong, but we are convinced that Nicolas Maduro remaining in power makes it impossible to carry out free and fair elections, free and credible elections. And that's why we have started to advocate within the mechanisms of our Constitution, which continues to be enforced for us, irrespective of the fact that there is now a National Constitutive Assembly. What we want to see is a great citizens' movement demanding for Nicolas Maduro to step down, and that would allow us to have elections.
Mais justement,
precisely, the opposition is not united. Lilian Tintori, do you still hear us? I have a question for you. In our democratic countries, especially in Switzerland, but in most European countries, it's difficult for us to understand that for such an important election, despite the climate of violence, there is no unity in the opposition. It's difficult for us to understand that the opposition cannot find common ground to fight. Of course, it must not be very easy, but common ground to fight against the president in office. Why isn't there a single candidate candidate for the opposition today? I know that the situation is tense, but why, politically, why isn't there a candidate for the opposition?
There aren't opposition candidates because many of them are prisoners. They have been sent into exile or made prisoner. But there is a strong unity. The government continues to insist that we are not united, but actually there is unity, and there is a clear unity for free Venezuela. However, we've been persecuted. We've suffered from harassment and persecution because of at the hands of the dictatorship. So we are united, and we'll continue to fight. There are going to be elections because there is no opposition candidate, because many of the candidates that have been put forward are fraudulent ones. We want to have elections, we want to have a chance to vote, and peaceful and fair elections, but we need them to be fair and transparent.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. The discussion is not over. I will now give the floor to the audience. So, in order for us to understand each other, I'll ask you to ask relatively short questions, no big speeches, and please tell us who you're asking the question to. There's a microphone that will be circulated in the room, and if I choose to give you the floor, well, it's a purely innocent choice because I don't know you and I can hardly see you in the room. There's a lady at the front. All right, now we'll ask the question in Spanish.
Je suis une militante. Soy Alexandra.
I'm an activist, a French Venezuelan citizen. I have two questions, one for Ms. Ortega. I'd like to know how you experienced this film. Of course, you're in a very special situation, but when you listen to the grandmother of Rosmit, obviously you are directly linked to that case in terms of his imprisonment. That would be my first question. And then the other question is for Mr. Cantón. What's going to happen in the ICC as Ms. Fatou Bensouda seems to have been stepped down, and Venezuela, I don't think, will have an independent criminal court, which is what happened in the Central African Republic. But it looks like that might not be possible for Venezuela.
Thank you for your two questions. Ms. Ortega, you have the floor, and then Mr. Cantón.
Well, as a Venezuelan citizen, of course, I am committed to seeing justice, and I'm also committed to seeing justice because that's why I'm here. I've been to the International Criminal Court to submit a complaint against Nicolas Maduro, and as part of that complaint, the preliminary investigation began, but it never really found anything. I mean, it could go on for 10, 20 or 30 years, but the complaint I made is a very clear one. There were 1,963 elements of proof, including orders, including ballistic evidence, including other proofs that were found. And from Geneva, I'm going to go to the International Criminal Court with further complaints, in addition to the one I made on the 16th of November. And there are new elements of proof now that I have, which prove the responsibility of Nicolas Maduro and other senior officials in the involvement in the massacre of Ronquito, where 7 people were murdered. And there are other human rights abuses, and I will inform people publicly of those elements when I go to the International Criminal Court. I have always been a woman of principle And I always look at all of the different aspects of the truth. I have nothing to be afraid of, and I'm here because I know that I'm being harassed, my family is being harassed, my friends are being harassed as well, and persecuted. That's why I have a lawyer who's defending me, who is now locked up in Venezuela.
Merci.
Thank you, Mrs. Ortega, for this very clear answer. Mr. Cantón, a word? What is your perspective?
That's right. I got off the plane just before I came here tonight, and so I didn't get any information about that piece of news, so I can't really say a lot about that. But I can say that the International Criminal Court is an institution with a certain history, and I don't think that that should be a problem for the prosecutor leaving. I don't think that's going to be a problem. There is an issue out there, and that is with regard to Latin American countries and the International Criminal Court. I think there is a lack of justice connected with the number of human rights abuses that take place in Latin America compared to the other cases being dealt with by the International Criminal Court in Africa or the regions around the world. In Latin America, we don't have the same magnitude at the moment. We might have had that in the 1970s, but we don't have that today. So I think it's a bit unfair, because we can't just wait for the International Criminal Court to be quicker about things and come up with proof on human rights abuses. One of the reasons why we got to this situation in the International Criminal Court is because countries didn't actually take measures given the information that they were getting from the Inter-American Human Rights Court. So we shouldn't be waiting for this to happen to deal with the human rights abuses that are taking place. That's why the Inter-American Court is an important tool. But we need to see the we need to see democracy coming back. So we need to see justice. And if justice doesn't come from the International Criminal Court, then we'll need to find that somewhere else. But if we want to have a peaceful country, we need to see justice.
Autre question.
So for your questions, your next question, I will ask you to ask shorter questions, and I will also ask our panelists to answer in a shorter manner so that we can hear several questions. I will now give the floor to see a few arms up at the back of the room. I don't know if it's a gentleman or a lady, but I will give the floor to the arm raised at the back of the room.
Thank you very much. My name is Joana Yalves, and I have two questions. I'm from Venezuela, by the way. My first question is for the everyday man in the street. I think Venezuela often gets forgotten by politicians around the world. What are the mechanisms that can be used by normal people to try to defend Venezuela's cause at international level? And my second question, given the diaspora of Venezuelans all over the world, what can we do? And what organizations can we go to so that this issue is brought to their attention, and so that everybody continues to talk about Venezuela, not only in Geneva, but all over the world, actually? Thank you.
Alors, je propose...
Thank you. I suggest that Rafael Uzcátegui answers the first part of the question, and then we'll give the floor to Lilian Tintori. So, on the ground, what can Venezuelans do? People from the street, what can they do to defend their human rights? Concretely, what can they do?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have institutions in our country, so you can't complain to an institution credibly. So you have to wait for the scandal to be well known abroad. So you need this to be visible, because the government doesn't really care about its reputation at international level. So unfortunately, you need to do everything you can to get that talked about at international level. With regard to the diaspora, well, Of course, Venezuelan immigration is new because this is something quite new for the UN and for Venezuela. So what we can do to try to put pressure on governments from different countries, starting with those in Latin America, to respect the fact that people are actually fleeing a very difficult situation, is talk to UNHCR. UNHCR has started to draw up guidelines on this, and I think it's important to pressure them so that there are rules giving rights to these Venezuelans who are fleeing the country, so that they are recognized as refugees who are fleeing from a very difficult situation.
Thank you. Lilian Tintori, you've had a second question. What can be done at grassroots level?
Well, every Venezuelan is key and is part of this puzzle, and that's why we know that each and every one of them is very important. Many of them have been separated from their families. So what can they do? Well, they can do a great deal. I would invite all of you to a large demonstration on the 17th of May. In every city around Venezuela, there will be an enormous national demonstration, and I want this to be an international demonstration to get Nicolas Maduro to leave. Next Saturday we're going to do that, and I think it's a very important event. I really think that we can bring freedom and democracy back to Venezuela.
Thank you. So, other questions from the floor? Let's move on to the other side of the room. There's no political color at play here, so you have the floor.
Good evening. I'm a Colombian pacifist, and I have a very short question for Leopoldo Lopez's wife. In Venezuela, there has been repression against people, right-wing individuals. There has also been repression against Chavistas. Dozens of Chavistas, senators and parliamentarians were murdered or assassinated by murderous groups who were sent out by the Venezuelan opposition. There was a very close link between the Venezuelan opposition and a very shady Colombian leader, Álvaro Uribe Vélez, who is the head of a very shady group. Please, could you ask a very short question? Please, could you keep your question short? I ask you to ask a question, please. You just have the floor for one question. Okay, I have a direct question. Isn't it possible for you to break relations with that murderous group called Centro Democrático Bolivistas Colombianas, who are a murderous group? Is it possible for you to break off relations with that group? Please, thank you. Please, I think we've understood your question, and I think now we've understood that question. So we can give the floor now to Lilian Tintori. I'm sure is going to reply to your question. And you'll have the proof that there is democratic debate. But we also need to be polite to one another and respect the time for each of us to speak. Did you understand the question? Yes, of course. The Venezuelan opposition has demonstrated over recent years in its actions and speeches that it is absolutely democratic, and we want to get out of this murderous regime, but through peaceful means. And my husband is an example of that. In 2014, he gave himself up to the authorities peacefully in order to denounce the regime, in order to bring about change, a change that is closer and closer. And the opposition has demonstrated on a number of occasions that it's interested in democracy, but through peaceful means. Very recently, it took place with negotiations in the Dominican Republic, but unfortunately that didn't bring results because the government simply did not take it seriously, because it didn't meet its promises. And we have hope, but we want to bring about democracy, and we have shown that we are democratic, not terrorists. And we have proof of that. I would like to see proof that we're not. I mean, we have Leopoldo Lopez being called a terrorist, but there is no proof of that. There's not a single proof. There isn't even a single witness describing any terrorism that he might be involved in. We don't believe in coup d'etat, we don't believe in violence, we don't believe in hatred or damaging our opponents, we believe in respect, we believe in human rights, in national reconciliation, and we believe in bringing back Venezuelans from abroad and bringing back democracy by peaceful means with democratic elections.
Merci pour cette
Thank you for this answer. We still have time for a couple of other questions. Right in the middle here, there's a lady in the room. Apologies, I don't have a very clear view in the room. You have the floor.
Good evening, everybody. My question is that you talk about the fact that we want to see change, but my question is, when will that take place? Because if there are elections and there is a united opposition, then why shouldn't we organize those elections and let the people decide and see if because the people are against the government and they will come out to vote. Aren't there more people out there than those who actually support the government? But maybe it's not a reliable political system. But surely, if this situation is so bad, if there were elections, then people would vote for change. Can they go out freely to vote? That's my concern. Why don't the opposition go for elections? Because I just think that this government is resting on its laurels while people are dying of hunger. And I haven't seen my family, and I don't want to see them dying of hunger in the streets.
Gracias. Je ne sais pas au niveau de la durée.
I don't know how long you will have to wait for perfectly incapable to answer this question. Is there a panelist who would like to answer how long do we have to wait for democracy to come back? Do you want to answer this question, Mrs. Ortega Diaz?
Si on commence à répondre aux questions d'avant, je crois que là, effectivement, on va se retrouver en 2025.
Right, we'll get to 2025 if we continue answering the previous questions. Could you please answer the question that has just been asked with the microphone, please?
I'll try and reply to the question on elections. I want to explain that in Venezuela there is no transparency. There aren't free and fair elections. I believe very strongly that we should have elections. I'm a Democrat. But the process that has been announced will not be fair. Only Maduro can win. And anyone taking part in that process will just give more credibility to Maduro, because no one else can win. Because Maduro just tells everyone what to do. The National Electoral Commission just does what he asks. So they didn't even give time for other candidates to come forward. There was no transparency in terms of putting candidacies forward, signing up on the electoral list. Participating in those elections in May will just not be free and fair. At the moment, it's just not possible to defeat Maduro. The only way would be for all of us to be united, and I mean all of us against Maduro, to come up with a single strategy to demand change in the National Electoral Commission and free and fair elections.
Vous noterez que c'est la première fois dans ce débat qu'on entend l'expression.
You'll know that it's the first time in this discussion that we hear the words overthrow Maduro. It had not been said in these terms until now. Any other questions?
Good evening. I have a question for all of you. The human rights abuses have no ideology. It happens in right-wing countries and left-wing countries. So what can we do to fight against human rights abuses without falling into ideological, unfounded discussions of politics. Please, go ahead. Well, that's why I talked about the 70th anniversary of the Universal Human Rights Declaration, and the spirit of that declaration, I think, is the most. It makes the human being at the very heart of those, and that's something that we've seen over the past 70 years. But it's not something that we're seeing today. In Latin America, we're seeing the politicization of this issue in many countries. In the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, my predecessor, when I was executive secretary, made great efforts to try to ensure that whatever happened in Latin America was unpoliticized. That's the only way that we are going to achieve human rights being respected, and that no one should be able to get away with human rights abuses, because if you politicize the situation, then you kill human rights. If you say it's just the left or just the right, then you are guaranteeing that the next government will not be able to ensure the promotion and protection of human rights. So we need to be very careful and denounce human rights wherever they occur and whenever they occur. And that's very difficult to do, because if we can't do that, then I'm afraid we will never see human rights being respected in Latin America.
Une précision.
Messi Uzcátegui, you want to add something?
In Venezuela, we talk about the difference between activists and human rights defenders. And if you just defend people who believe like you do, then you're an activist. But if you're a human rights defender, then you defend human rights more broadly. You have a great responsibility. And you should be able to demonstrate those human rights being abused.
L'heure avance.
It's getting late, but we have time for one last question. Gentleman at the back.
Hola, buenas noches.
Good evening. Well, I'd just like to thank the panel and the organizers of this panel. My name is Francisco, and I'm a Venezuelan lawyer and a human rights defender. And my question is for Ms. Ortega Diaz. Why did you allow the appointment of public prosecutors in 2007, even if you knew that it wasn't going to be possible to ensure human rights for the Venezuelan people? Why did you accept that post in the first place? Well, I began in the Attorney General not in 2007 but in 2008, but I took on that role and I left the magistrate school in Venezuela with a determination to make change. We carried out 17 rounds of open competitions to appoint new public prosecutors, and I began to see, I tried to install security of career for judges, because that's the only thing that will make the judicial system impartial and transparent, if you have prosecutors who don't fear for their jobs.
Well, that takes us to the end of the discussion. I would like to thank all the panelists for having expressed their views with such conviction and determination. I would like to thank Lilian Tintori for having answered our questions. I would like to thank Claire and Carole Marola, who did very commendable work to allow us to exchange our views here tonight. And I would like to thank you for the respect that you've shown tonight. There were 5 women that were with us tonight, even though they were not here in person. I would like to salute Kim, Maria Rosé, Eva, Luisa and Olga. Thank you.